My beloved child, something about last night did not unfold the way anyone expected, and the most important part is not simply who was there, it is what your special person realized while sitting in that room. There was a third party nearby. There was another person involved in the conversation. And for a brief moment, everything looked ordinary enough that no one would have guessed your name was about to change the entire atmosphere. But stay with this, because the surprising part is not a dramatic confrontation or some impossible secret. It is quieter than that, and perhaps more meaningful. Your soulmate walked into that moment believing they could keep certain feelings neatly separated. They thought they could listen, smile, answer a few questions, and leave without revealing what had been living beneath the surface for so long. Yet one innocent sentence from someone at the table made that impossible. They were asked what they truly wanted their life to feel like a year from now. Not who they wanted to impress. Not what other people expected. What they wanted to feel when the noise finally disappeared. And that question landed differently than anyone anticipated. For a few seconds, your soulmate said nothing. The third party noticed. The other person noticed. Even your soulmate seemed surprised by their own hesitation. Because somewhere inside that silence, an image appeared in their mind and it was connected to you. Don't skip, because what happened after that silence reveals far more than the question itself. Instead of giving the easy answer everyone expected, your soulmate lowered their voice and said something remarkably simple: they wanted peace. They wanted honesty. They wanted to stop pretending that certain connections meant less than they actually did. Those words were not a confession yet, but the third party understood enough to become unusually quiet. Something had shifted. Your soulmate was no longer speaking about appearances. They were speaking from a place they usually protected. And then came the detail no one could have planned. The person sitting across from them asked, almost casually, "When was the last time you felt that kind of peace with someone?" Your soulmate looked away. Not because they had no answer, but because the answer arrived immediately. It was you. There are moments when a person can hide behind complicated explanations, and there are moments when the heart answers before the mind has time to create one. Last night became the second kind of moment. Your soulmate remembered something small about you. Not some grand dramatic scene. Something almost forgettable to anyone else. A conversation. A look. A moment when you listened without trying to change them. A time when being around you felt strangely uncomplicated. And suddenly the entire night carried a different meaning. The third party had expected the conversation to move in another direction. Perhaps they believed your soulmate had finally moved beyond whatever connection remained between you. Perhaps they assumed distance had created indifference. Yet what they witnessed was not indifference at all. It was recognition. Quiet recognition. And the strange thing about recognition is that once it appears clearly, pretending becomes much harder. Something important is waiting for you here, because the biggest surprise of the night was not that your soulmate thought about you. It was what they admitted to themselves afterward. When the conversation moved on, your soulmate became quieter. They watched the others speak, but part of them was somewhere else. They began connecting moments they had previously treated as separate pieces, the times they almost reached out, the memories that returned unexpectedly, the way certain songs or places reminded them of conversations with you, the strange pull to know whether you were doing well even when they told themselves they should simply leave everything alone. Until last night, they could explain each of those things individually. Nostalgia, timing, habit, curiosity. But when they appeared together, those explanations no longer felt complete. Then the third party said something that accidentally pushed the realization even further. They suggested that sometimes people miss an idea rather than a person. Your soulmate initially nodded. It sounded reasonable. Safe, even. But something inside them resisted. Because when they thought about you, they were not remembering an imaginary version of you. They remembered imperfections too. The awkward moments. The misunderstandings. The things neither of you knew how to say properly. And somehow that made the feeling more real, not less. Your soulmate realized they were not longing for perfection. They were remembering a connection that had actually affected them. That distinction mattered. Stay till the end, because this is where last night began turning into something your soulmate could no longer dismiss. The other person asked one more question. If that person stood in front of you tomorrow, what would you wish you had the courage to say? No one mentioned your name. They did not need to. Your soulmate's expression changed immediately. The third party saw it. There was a pause long enough to make the room feel unusually still. And then your soulmate smiled, not the effortless social smile people use when they want to escape a difficult subject, but the kind that appears when a private memory unexpectedly becomes warm. They said they would probably begin with an apology. Not because everything had been their responsibility, and not because the past needed to be rewritten, but because there were things they understood now that they did not understand then. That was the first honest doorway. What followed surprised even them. Your soulmate admitted that sometimes people recognize the importance of someone only after enough quiet has passed for all the outside opinions to disappear. Think about that for a moment. Last night was supposed to be about moving forward, clearing the air, perhaps even allowing other people to influence how your soulmate viewed the connection. Instead, every question seemed to lead them backward towards something unfinished between you. Yet this was not about returning to the past unchanged. That is the deeper realization beginning to form. Your soulmate does not want the exact relationship, conversation, or emotional pattern that existed before. They are wondering whether something healthier could exist now, something clearer, slower, more honest. And that difference is important because longing alone does not create a meaningful future. Understanding does. At one point, your soulmate reached for their phone. They did not immediately message you. They simply unlocked the screen and stared for a moment longer than necessary. The third party noticed this too. Maybe your name was somewhere in their thoughts. Maybe an old conversation crossed their mind. Whatever the precise detail, something stopped them from treating the moment casually. They placed the phone down again. That hesitation reveals something powerful. Your soulmate is no longer asking only, "Do I still feel something?" They are beginning to ask, "What would I actually do with what I feel?" Those are very different questions. One belongs to memory. The other belongs to possibility. And possibility requires courage. The atmosphere softened after that. No argument followed. No dramatic scene. That is why what happened feels so surprising. The third party did not need to be defeated. No one needed to become the villain of the evening. The truth simply became harder to avoid. Your soulmate realized that outside voices had been occupying too much space in a decision that ultimately belonged to their own heart and judgment. There had been opinions, assumptions, perhaps misunderstandings, perhaps even people trying to protect them from disappointment. But last night your soulmate finally recognized something adults often learn slowly: advice can guide you, but it cannot feel for you. Other people can describe a connection from the outside, but they cannot fully know what happened inside it. That realization changed the way your soulmate listened for the remainder of the night. They stopped looking for permission. They stopped waiting for someone else to tell them what your connection meant. Instead, they quietly began forming their own answer. And here is where your presence becomes unexpectedly important. You may have wondered whether your silence mattered. Whether stepping back meant disappearing from their emotional world. Whether the absence of obvious movement meant there was nothing left to understand. But sometimes distance does something conversation cannot. It removes the immediate emotional noise and allows people to recognize what remains when nothing is demanding their attention. Last night, something remained. Your soulmate remembered the way you made certain moments feel less complicated. They remembered details they assumed they had forgotten. They remembered how easily they could recognize your mood, how certain words from you stayed with them longer than expected, how the connection challenged them to think differently about themselves. Those memories did not arrive as a flood. They appeared one by one. That is what made them difficult to dismiss. Then something almost ironic happened. The third party attempted to lighten the conversation by mentioning that everyone eventually meets someone who changes their standards. Your soulmate smiled again. Someone asked what that meant for them. And without realizing how revealing the answer would sound, your soulmate said, "I think that already happened." Silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Curious silence. The kind where everyone knows another sentence is waiting nearby. Your soulmate did not immediately explain. They looked down, almost amused at themselves, because they understood who they had just described. You. Something in your connection had quietly changed what they consider meaningful. Not because everything was perfect, but because you introduced a particular emotional depth they now notice when it is missing elsewhere. That may be the most important revelation from last night. Your soulmate was not comparing people by appearance, attention, or excitement. They were comparing how deeply understood they felt. And that comparison led somewhere the third party had not expected. It led straight back toward you. But there is another layer, and this one is softer. Your soulmate also recognized something about you that they had previously misunderstood. They once interpreted your restraint as distance. Your silence as uncertainty. Your decision not to chase every confusing moment as evidence that perhaps you cared less. Last night, while explaining the connection aloud, they began to see another possibility. Maybe some of your quietness was self-respect. Maybe you were refusing to force something that needed two willing people. Maybe you cared enough not to turn the connection into a constant struggle for reassurance. That realization touched something deeper than nostalgia. It brought respect. And respect changes the emotional landscape because it shifts the question from, "Why didn't they fight harder for me?" to, "Was I expecting them to carry something that required both of us?" Your soulmate sat with that thought. Nobody at the table could answer it for them. This belonged entirely to their inner world. Don't skip this moment, because the next detail is where curiosity becomes intention. When the evening finally began winding down, your soulmate stepped away for a moment and checked their phone again. This time they did something different. They searched for something connected to you. Perhaps an old conversation. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps simply your name. They did not send anything yet. But their expression changed. The evening had moved them from passive memory toward a decision they were not ready to announce. And there is something beautiful about the fact that they did not rush. Real emotional clarity often arrives quietly. It asks people to examine what they want before they involve someone else's heart again. Your soulmate seems to understand that now. They know that if they approach you, vague words will not be enough. They cannot return with the same uncertainty and expect a different outcome. If there is going to be a next step, it needs to carry more honesty than what came before. That is why the unanswered question from last night matters so much. What exactly is your soulmate considering saying to you? The third party sensed that something had changed, but they did not hear everything happening inside your soulmate's mind. Neither did the other person. The final realization came later, when your soulmate was alone and replayed one sentence from the conversation. It was the question about what they would say if you were standing in front of them tomorrow. This time, without anyone watching, they answered it fully. And the first words were not what anyone at that table would have predicted. They were not about missing you. They were not about returning to the past. They were about something your soulmate finally understands about the way they handled your connection, and once those words formed clearly in their mind, they opened your conversation again. What happened next is where last night stops being merely a memory, and begins pointing toward what may happen between you next. The message was never sent, and strangely, that may be the most revealing part of what happened after everyone went home. Your soulmate opened the conversation with you, stared at the empty space where new words could have appeared, and suddenly understood that reaching out was not simply about breaking silence. It was about deciding what kind of truth they were prepared to bring into your life. For several minutes, they wrote something, erased it, started again, then stopped completely. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because the first version sounded too ordinary for everything they had finally understood. I was thinking about you did not seem enough. I miss talking to you felt incomplete. Even, can we talk, seemed to ignore the deeper realization that had followed them home from that unusual evening. Something important is waiting for you here, because the words they ultimately wanted to say were not designed to pull you backward. They were about acknowledging something they had previously failed to see. Your soulmate realized that while they had spent so much time wondering whether you still cared, they had rarely stopped to ask whether they had made it safe for you to show that care. That question stayed with them. It changed the entire emotional direction of the night. Think about how subtle that realization is. Sometimes two people can care about each other and still misread the silence between them. One person waits for reassurance. The other waits for consistency. One interprets hesitation as rejection. The other interprets pressure as uncertainty. Eventually, both begin protecting themselves, and neither understands why something meaningful suddenly feels so difficult. Your soulmate began wondering whether that had happened between you. And for the first time in a long while, they were not analyzing your behavior. They were examining their own. That shift mattered. The third party had spent part of the evening discussing what you supposedly felt, what you might have meant, why you behaved in certain ways, but once your soulmate was alone, those interpretations began losing their influence. They realized nobody else could accurately explain your heart. If they genuinely wanted clarity, there was only one person they could eventually ask. You. Don't skip, because the next realization surprised your soulmate even more. They remembered a moment from the past when you had tried to tell them something important, but the timing had been wrong. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe emotions were running too high. Maybe they heard your words without fully understanding what was underneath them. Yet last night, that old conversation suddenly sounded different in memory. Your soulmate recognized that you had not been demanding certainty from them. You had been asking for honesty. There is a difference. Certainty requires someone to know the entire future. Honesty simply asks them to tell the truth about where they are standing today. And your soulmate now understands they may have avoided honesty because they believed they needed certainty first. That mistake created distance. They kept waiting until everything felt perfectly clear, while you may have been waiting for one sincere sentence. Once they saw that, another memory appeared. A time you became unexpectedly quiet after something they said. Your soulmate had interpreted that quietness as indifference, but now they wondered whether you had actually been hurt and simply chose not to turn your feelings into a confrontation. The memory stayed with them longer than expected. It was not guilt that overwhelmed them. It was awareness. A calm awareness that relationships often change because of tiny moments nobody realizes are important while they are happening. A delayed response. A misunderstood joke. A conversation ended too early. A vulnerable sentence answered too casually. These moments seem insignificant until enough of them accumulate and two people suddenly find themselves standing farther apart than either intended. Your soulmate began tracing those small moments backward, and what they discovered was not a single dramatic mistake. It was something much more human. Both of you may have been protecting yourselves at the same time. And when two people protect themselves simultaneously, affection can begin looking like distance. That thought softened something in them. Instead of asking who was right and who was wrong, they began asking what neither of you knew how to communicate at the time. Stay till the end, because the person who was with your soulmate last night noticed this shift before the evening even ended, and they said something your soulmate has not been able to forget. While everyone was preparing to leave, that person quietly asked, "Why do you become calmer every time you talk about them?" Your soulmate laughed softly at first, almost as though the question were too simple to matter. But then they realized it was true. Whenever your name entered the conversation, their voice changed. Their defensiveness disappeared. They stopped trying to prove anything. Even when describing difficult memories, there was a certain tenderness underneath the words. That person noticed it immediately. The third party noticed something too, although they interpreted it differently. They assumed nostalgia was pulling your soulmate backward. But your soulmate did not feel pulled backward. They felt clearer. There is an important distinction between missing the past and understanding it. Missing the past says, "I want everything exactly as it was." Understanding the past says, now I see what mattered, what failed, and what would need to be different. Your soulmate was experiencing the second. And that is why they did not send the first message they typed. They did not want to reopen your connection merely because one emotional evening stirred old memories. They wanted to know whether their realization would still feel true when the emotion settled. So they did something unexpected. They put the phone away. They walked into another room, poured themselves something to drink, and let several minutes pass without touching the screen again. No distractions. No opinions. No third party speaking. No one telling them what your connection should or should not mean. Just silence. And in that silence, the feeling remained. Not urgency. Not obsession. Not some exaggerated need to fix everything immediately. Something steadier. The feeling that there was one conversation between you that had never truly been completed. That was when your soulmate finally admitted something they had avoided for longer than they realized. They had been waiting for you to create an opening while simultaneously giving you very little reason to believe an opening existed. That contradiction stopped them. Imagine expecting someone to knock on a door you have quietly kept closed. Your soulmate suddenly saw the unfairness in that. Maybe you had looked for signs. Maybe you wondered whether reaching out would be welcomed. Maybe you considered saying something and then chose peace because you did not know where you stood. Your soulmate could not know exactly what happened inside your mind, and importantly, they stopped pretending they could. They simply realized that your silence might have contained just as many unanswered thoughts as theirs. That possibility created a new kind of curiosity. Not, does this person still want me, but what was their experience of everything that happened between us? That is a much more mature question, because it does not make you a character in somebody else's emotional story. It recognizes that you have your own version of events. Your own disappointments. Your own reasons for stepping closer or farther away. Your own boundaries. Your own hopes. And your soulmate realized that if a conversation ever happens, listening may matter even more than speaking. Something shifted again after that. They picked up the phone, but instead of opening your chat immediately, they opened an old photograph. There was nothing extraordinary about the image. Maybe you were both somewhere familiar. Maybe the lighting was imperfect. Maybe the moment had been taken without anyone realizing it would later carry emotional meaning. But your soulmate noticed their own expression. They looked relaxed. Not performing. Not guarded. Just present. They had forgotten that version of themselves. And suddenly the question from earlier returned, when was the last time you felt that kind of peace with someone? The photograph seemed to answer without words. But there was another detail. Your soulmate looked at you in the picture and remembered what had happened shortly before or after it was taken. A small conversation nobody else would understand. A sentence you said. A laugh you tried to hide. Something completely ordinary that had remained stored in their memory for all this time. And that was the moment they stopped wondering whether last night had simply made them sentimental. Sentimentality usually paints the past in perfect colors. But your soulmate remembered everything, the good moments and the uncomfortable ones, and still felt that something had been meaningful. That is what made the realization harder to dismiss. The third party had suggested that perhaps your connection was simply familiar. Your soulmate now understood familiarity was not the whole story. Plenty of things become familiar without becoming meaningful. What stayed with them was the sense that you had seen parts of them they rarely explained to anyone. Their hesitation. Their humor when nervous. The moments when they pretended something did not matter even though it did. You had noticed details. And your soulmate remembered noticing details about you too. That mutual attention was part of what made the connection difficult to replace. Not because nobody else could ever understand either of you, but because genuine understanding takes time, and the two of you had already built some of it without realizing how valuable it was. Then came the sentence they finally typed. It began differently from every earlier attempt. They did not write, "I miss you." They did not write, "We need to talk." They wrote something closer to what they had truly discovered. "I think there are things I understand now that I didn't understand when we were talking before." Your soulmate stared at those words for a long time. They felt accurate. Vulnerable, but not overwhelming. Honest, but not demanding. They added another line. Something about not expecting anything from you. Something about wanting to acknowledge their part in how confusing things became. Then they stopped again. Not because they wanted to disappear, but because they suddenly wondered whether sending a message late at night would make the moment feel more impulsive than intentional. And that mattered to them. The title of this moment may sound like it belongs to last night, but your soulmate's biggest decision was actually about today. They decided that if they spoke to you, they wanted to do it with the same clarity in daylight that they felt during the emotion of the night. So the draft remained unsent. That is why the hours before nightfall feel symbolic in this story, not because something must happen by a certain clock, but because your soulmate is quietly testing whether the truth they discovered last night can survive an ordinary day. Morning arrived. Life resumed. Messages appeared. Responsibilities returned. The emotional atmosphere of the previous evening faded. And yet, you remained on their mind. Not constantly. Not unrealistically. But repeatedly, in little spaces between everything else. Your soulmate noticed this. They made breakfast and remembered the conversation. They checked their phone and saw the unfinished draft. They went about their day and wondered how you would react if those words appeared on your screen. Would you be surprised? Would you hesitate? Would you feel relieved? Would you wonder why now? They knew they could not control your response, and for once, that did not stop them from considering honesty. Earlier versions of your soulmate wanted certainty that vulnerability would be rewarded before taking any emotional risk. This version is beginning to understand that honest communication cannot come with guarantees. You say what is true respectfully, and then you allow the other person freedom to receive it however they need to. That realization may be the strongest sign of what changed last night. The third party was still present in their thoughts too, but differently. Your soulmate replayed certain comments that person had made about you and noticed something they had previously overlooked. Many of those comments were interpretations, not facts. Someone would say, if they cared, they would have. Or, if they really wanted this, they should have. And your soulmate used to absorb those statements as though relationships followed universal rules. Now they saw the problem. People show care differently. People withdraw for different reasons. People hesitate because of timing, uncertainty, pride, self-protection, or simply because they do not know what the other person wants. Nobody at that table truly knew what you were thinking. Your soulmate finally recognized that. And once they did, the third party's influence became quieter. Not because anyone was exposed as terrible or dishonest, but because your soulmate understood that advice becomes dangerous when it replaces direct communication. Someone can mean well and still misunderstand a situation. Someone can care about your soulmate and still project their own experiences onto yours. Last night gave your soulmate permission to separate those voices. What do I know? What am I assuming? What have I actually asked? Those three questions became surprisingly powerful. They realized they knew certain things about you from real experiences. They assumed many other things based on silence. And there were questions they had never directly asked you. That final category became the one they could not stop thinking about. What did you actually feel when everything changed? What did you need from them that you never received? Did you step back because your feelings disappeared, or because continuing in uncertainty became exhausting? Did you ever look at your phone and consider reaching out too? Your soulmate did not create answers. That was important. Instead, they allowed the questions to remain questions. Because perhaps the next chapter of this connection, whatever shape it eventually takes, begins not with declarations but with curiosity. Real curiosity. The willingness to learn who you are now rather than interacting with a memory of who you were. There is another surprising part. The person who had been sitting across from your soulmate last night sent them a message this morning. It was short. Almost casual. But it returned your soulmate to the exact emotional moment when your name changed the atmosphere. The message said something simple about trusting the version of themselves that sounded most peaceful. Your soulmate read that line twice. Then they opened the draft to you again. This time, they removed one sentence. It was a sentence explaining too much. A sentence trying to defend the past. They realized they did not want their first honest conversation with you to become an argument about old details. So they simplified the message. Less explanation. More sincerity. They replaced defensiveness with responsibility. They replaced assumptions about your feelings with questions. And when they finished, they read the message aloud to themselves. Something felt different. The words no longer sounded like an attempt to pull you back into their life. They sounded like an invitation for clarity. And perhaps that is exactly what your connection has needed. But your soulmate still did not press send. Not yet. Because one final concern had surfaced. What if contacting you reopened something you had already found peace with? What if you had moved forward emotionally? What if their realization arrived later than your own? Instead of allowing those fears to become excuses, your soulmate began thinking about how to respect your freedom in the message itself. They wanted you to know that no response would be forced. That honesty was being offered, not demanded. That if you chose to answer, they would listen. And if you needed time, they would understand. That change in approach mattered more than any dramatic declaration could. Sometimes the biggest transformation is not someone finally saying, "Choose me." It is someone becoming emotionally steady enough to say, "I want to tell you the truth," and I respect your right to decide what you do with it. That may be where your soulmate is heading now. But something happened around midday that complicated their decision in an unexpected way. The third party contacted them too. At first the conversation seemed completely unrelated to you. A normal check-in. A reference to last night. Then, almost casually, the third party asked whether your soulmate had been thinking about that person again. Your soulmate knew immediately who they meant. They could have laughed it off. They could have changed the subject. That is what they might have done previously. Instead, they answered with one quiet sentence, "I think I need to stop letting other people decide what I should feel about it." There was no anger. No accusation. No conflict. Just a boundary. The third party went silent for a moment. Then they asked something that changed the tone entirely. "So are you going to reach out?" Your soulmate looked at the draft on their screen. And for the first time, they did not say no. They did not say yes either. They simply said, "If I do, I want to do it for the right reason." That answer reveals where everything stands right now. Your soulmate is not chasing an emotional impulse from last night. They are deciding whether honesty would bring clarity rather than confusion. They are thinking about your perspective. They are thinking about what would actually be different if the two of you spoke again. And somewhere inside those questions, they have reached another realization that may surprise you more than anything so far. The thing they want most from you is not an immediate reunion, a promise, or even an answer about the future. They want one real conversation where neither of you has to pretend the connection meant less than it did. One conversation without outsiders interpreting every silence. One conversation without guessing. One conversation where both of you can finally say what was happening underneath all those moments you misunderstood. But here is where the mystery deepens, because after that call with the third party ended, your soulmate changed the draft one final time. They added a sentence that had not appeared in any version before. It was the most personal line they had written all day, and it came from the exact realization that kept them awake after last night's conversation. They read it once, then twice, then rested their finger above the send button. The sentence was not about what they wanted from you. It was about what they finally understood you may have needed from them all along. And if those words reach you, they could change the way you interpret everything that happened between you. But there is still one detail from last night your soulmate has not fully processed, because the person sitting across from them revealed something about you shortly before everyone left, something your soulmate never knew you had said. What your soulmate heard next was not a confession meant to reach them, and that is exactly why it stayed with them long after the night ended. The person sitting across from them had hesitated before speaking, almost as if they were deciding whether the detail even belonged in the conversation. Then they quietly mentioned that, some time ago, you had said something about your soulmate that nobody expected. You had not criticized them. You had not blamed them for everything that became complicated. You had simply said that sometimes you wished they understood how difficult it had been to care deeply while never knowing whether there was truly a place for you in their life. Your soulmate became completely still when they heard that. Not because the sentence was dramatic, but because it explained something they had been interpreting incorrectly for far too long. Suddenly, your silence looked different. Your distance looked different. Even some of the moments when you appeared unusually calm began to make sense. Maybe you were not unaffected. Maybe you were trying to protect yourself from remaining indefinitely inside a connection that felt meaningful but uncertain. The person continued, saying that you had never spoken with bitterness. In fact, what surprised them most was how carefully you had protected your soulmate's image while explaining your own feelings. You had apparently said something close to, "I don't think they were trying to hurt me. I think they just didn't know what they wanted yet." That sentence followed your soulmate home. It followed them into the quiet room where they opened your old conversation. It followed them into the morning when they read the unfinished draft again. And it followed them into the moment when they finally understood what had been missing from every version of the message they were trying to send you. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate suddenly realized that you had given them something they had never fully appreciated: room to be uncertain without turning that uncertainty into a character judgment. You did not make them the villain of your story simply because they struggled to understand their own feelings. You may have been disappointed. You may have needed distance. You may have wished they had been clearer. But according to what they heard last night, you still tried to see their humanity inside the confusion. That realization softened something in them. And strangely, it made them more willing to take responsibility, not less. Because when people feel attacked, they often defend themselves. But when they realize someone treated their mistakes with grace, they sometimes become brave enough to look directly at those mistakes without hiding. Your soulmate began thinking about the times they had assumed your patience meant you would always be there whenever they finally figured everything out. That assumption did not feel fair anymore. They could suddenly see that patience has limits, and that care should never be treated as an unlimited resource someone can return to whenever convenient. You had a life too. You had emotions too. You had your own need for clarity, dignity, and peace. And perhaps the most surprising thing your soulmate understood was that you stepping back may not have been the end of caring. It may have been the moment you finally stopped abandoning yourself in order to keep the connection alive. Don't skip, because this is where the message on their phone changed again. Your soulmate deleted another sentence. The earlier version said something like, "I wish you had told me how you felt." After hearing what you had apparently shared, that sentence suddenly seemed wrong. Perhaps you had told them. Maybe not in the exact language they were ready to recognize, but through your pauses, your attempts at conversation, your moments of disappointment, your choice to become quieter when repeating yourself stopped feeling useful. Your soulmate realized that listening is not simply hearing words. Sometimes it is recognizing the emotion someone has already explained in 10 smaller ways. So they replaced that line with something entirely different. "I think you tried to tell me more than I understood at the time." They stared at it. For the first time, the message felt less like an explanation of their feelings and more like acknowledgement of yours. That mattered deeply. Because your soulmate had spent so much of the past wondering whether you understood them that they had rarely considered whether they had truly understood you. Now that question became impossible to ignore. What had your experience actually been? How many times had you chosen softness when frustration would have been easier? How many times had you wanted to ask where everything was going but stopped because you did not want to pressure them? How many times had you given them another chance to become clear, only to realize they were still searching for answers inside themselves? Your soulmate could not know every answer. But they knew enough now to see that their previous interpretation had been incomplete. And then came another unexpected realization: the third party had been wrong about something too, although perhaps unintentionally. During earlier conversations, the third party had often suggested that your decision to step back proved that you did not care enough. Last night changed that interpretation completely. If what the other person revealed was accurate, your distance may have come precisely because you cared enough to know that endless uncertainty would eventually damage something meaningful. Sometimes leaving space is not rejection. Sometimes it is the only way to keep affection from turning into resentment. Your soulmate had never viewed it that way before. They had interpreted your absence through their own fear of being forgotten. Now they considered that maybe you had been standing on the other side of the same distance, wondering why someone who mattered to you was not giving you a reason to stay close. Two people. Two interpretations. One silence. That thought created a strange tenderness in them. Not fantasy. Not certainty about what comes next. Just an understanding that perhaps neither of you had been as indifferent as the distance made it appear. Stay till the end, because one detail from last night began to matter more as the day went on. When that person shared what you had once said, the third party did not interrupt. They did not argue. They simply looked at your soulmate and waited. Your soulmate noticed this later while replaying the scene. For all the assumptions and opinions that had surrounded your connection, nobody at that table could deny the effect your words had on them. Their entire posture had changed. The conversation that had started as casual reflection had become deeply personal. And instead of resisting it, your soulmate allowed the truth to settle. They asked when you had said those words. They asked what the conversation had been about. They asked whether you had seemed upset. The person answered carefully. Apparently, you had not been asking them to deliver a message. You were not trying to reach your soulmate indirectly. You had simply been speaking honestly during a quiet conversation, unaware that the words would ever circle back. That detail made everything more meaningful. Your soulmate understood that you had not said those things for effect. There had been no strategy. No attempt to create guilt. No hidden expectation that someone would report it back. It had been a genuine glimpse into what you felt at the time. Your soulmate kept returning to one phrase: "I never knew whether there was truly a place for me." That was the sentence that changed the draft most. Because your soulmate finally recognized that while they had felt a strong connection with you, they may not have translated that feeling into something you could rely upon. They may have expected you to understand their affection through chemistry, attention, occasional vulnerability, or meaningful moments. But affection that is never clarified can become exhausting to interpret. Someone can feel important and still feel uncertain. Someone can be loved in private and still feel invisible in practice. That is what your soulmate was beginning to understand. And once they saw that distinction, their next question became unavoidable: if they contacted you now, would their behavior finally match what they claimed to feel? They did not want to send beautiful words followed by the same inconsistency. They did not want one emotional conversation that disappeared into another long silence. They did not want to awaken hope unless they were prepared to communicate differently. That is why the message remained unsent for several more hours. Not because your soulmate lost courage, but because they started asking a more responsible question. What can I actually offer this person now? That question was harder than, do I miss them? Missing someone is a feeling. Showing up consistently is a choice. Your soulmate realized that if they could not offer clarity about everything, they could at least offer clarity about their intentions. They could tell you why they were reaching out. They could stop hiding behind vague language. They could ask what you needed instead of assuming. They could listen without immediately defending the past. They could accept that you might not respond the way they hoped. Those realizations formed slowly throughout the day. And each one made the message simpler. The dramatic lines disappeared. The explanations became shorter. The emotional truth became clearer. At one point, your soulmate had written a long paragraph about how complicated everything had been. They deleted nearly all of it. Complicated was true, but it was also an easy place to hide. So they wrote something more vulnerable instead. I think I made you carry more uncertainty than I realized. That line frightened them slightly because it left nowhere to retreat. It acknowledged impact without arguing intention. They may never have wanted you to feel uncertain, but intention does not erase experience. Your soulmate understood that now. Something about that sentence gave them a sense of calm. They read it again. Then another line appeared beneath it: you deserved more clarity from me. That was the sentence they had been approaching since last night without knowing how to say it. And this time, they did not delete it. There was no accusation toward the third party. No attempt to blame timing, circumstances, distance, or confusion. Just one clean acknowledgement. You deserved more clarity. Your soulmate sat with that truth for several minutes. Perhaps because part of them knew that saying it meant accepting whatever came afterward. You might welcome the conversation. You might be cautious. You might need time. You might have questions they could not answer perfectly. Your soulmate finally understood that sincerity is not measured by receiving the response you want. It is measured by whether you can remain respectful even when the other person's response is uncertain. That may sound simple, but for your soulmate it represented an enormous internal shift. Previously, they often waited until they felt emotionally safe before revealing anything important. Now they were considering vulnerability without demanding a guarantee. And somewhere in that shift, the third party became far less central to the story. This was no longer about whether somebody else approved of you. It was no longer about proving that an outside opinion had been mistaken. Your soulmate realized they had spent too much time treating their connection with you like something that needed to be evaluated by a committee. Friends, relatives, acquaintances, personal fears, old experiences. Too many voices had entered a conversation that ultimately needed to. Last night simply exposed how crowded the space between you had become. Today, your soulmate wanted to clear some of that noise away. Not to ignore wise advice. Not to reject everyone who cared about them. But to recognize the boundary between receiving advice and surrendering emotional responsibility. The third party could have an opinion. The person at the table could have an observation. Your soulmate could listen to both. But only you could explain what being inside the connection had felt like for you. That is why the possibility of talking to you began feeling less frightening and more necessary. Not because they expected a particular outcome. Because unanswered assumptions had been controlling the story for too long. Then something subtle happened. Your soulmate opened the draft and noticed how many times the word "I" appeared. I realized. I think. I wanted. I feel. They laughed quietly at themselves. Even while trying to understand you, the message was still centered almost entirely around them. So they changed it again. They added one question: if you ever feel comfortable talking, would genuinely like to understand what that time was like for you. That sentence transformed the message. Suddenly, it was not a speech. It was an opening. A space where your experience mattered equally. Your soulmate imagined you reading it. They imagined your first reaction, not what they wished you would feel, but what you might realistically feel. Surprise, perhaps. Caution. Curiosity. Maybe even a small sense of validation that something you had once tried to communicate was finally being recognized. Your soulmate knew they could not rewrite the past. But they could refuse to repeat the same listening mistakes in the present. That became the quiet promise underneath the entire draft. And yet, one final piece of last night still bothered them. The third party had gone unusually quiet after the person revealed what you had once said. Later, as everyone was leaving, your soulmate asked why. The third party hesitated, then admitted something unexpectedly thoughtful. They said they may have judged your silence too quickly. They had assumed that if you wanted the connection, you would have fought harder to keep it alive. But hearing what you had apparently felt made them reconsider. Maybe, they said, you had already tried in ways nobody else noticed. Maybe walking away from uncertainty had required more strength than staying. Your soulmate did not expect that admission. It changed the emotional shape of the entire evening. The third party did not become an enemy. In fact, they became another person slowly realizing that the story was more nuanced than it looked from outside. This mattered because your soulmate had previously used other people's certainty as a substitute for their own. When someone said, they would have stayed if they cared, it gave your soulmate an easy explanation. But easy explanations are not always accurate. Last night, even the person who had reinforced that interpretation began questioning it. And once that happened, your soulmate lost the last comfortable excuse for avoiding direct conversation. The only honest path left was curiosity. Ask you. Listen. Accept what you say. Something important is waiting for you in that shift. Your soulmate is not preparing a dramatic confession designed to change your life in a single moment. They are preparing for something potentially more meaningful, a conversation where they finally stop assuming they already know your side. That is why they have been thinking so carefully about the first sentence. First sentences matter when there has been silence. Too casual, and the deeper intention disappears. Too emotional, and it can feel overwhelming. Too vague, and you are forced back into the same uncertainty they now regret creating. Your soulmate wanted something simple enough to feel safe, but honest enough to make their purpose clear. Eventually, after changing it several times, they settled on words that surprised them with their calmness. I've been thinking about something I understand differently now, and I owe you some honesty about it. They read it slowly. Nothing manipulative. Nothing demanding. No promise that the future had already been decided. Just truth approaching the door. Then they added the line that had survived every revision: you deserved more clarity from me. Your soulmate's thumb hovered near the screen again. The sun had moved lower. The day was beginning to soften toward evening. And the symbolic deadline they had quietly created for themselves was approaching. They had told themselves they would not act because of the emotion of the previous night. They wanted to see whether the clarity remained through daylight. It had. In fact, it had become stronger. But another thought arrived just before they could decide. What if the most respectful thing was not to send a long message at all? What if they simply asked whether you were open to talking? Your soulmate started reconsidering the entire draft. They imagined receiving a long emotional paragraph unexpectedly and realized it might be too much. So they copied the important thoughts into their notes and returned to the empty message field. One sentence. Then another. This version was shorter. Gentler. It left you room. Your soulmate began to understand that sincerity does not require overwhelming someone with every realization at once. Sometimes respecting another person means allowing truth to unfold at a pace both people can handle. That lesson was almost poetic considering everything that had happened between you. So much of the original connection had suffered from too little clarity at the wrong times. Your soulmate did not want to compensate by giving too much intensity all at once. Balance mattered. They wanted you to feel invited, not cornered. Seen, not analyzed. Respected, not persuaded. And that is when they finally decided what the first message should accomplish. It did not need to repair the past. It did not need to define the future. It only needed to open a door honestly. Your soulmate wrote, "There's something I've understood differently lately, and if you're ever comfortable, I'd like to talk about it." Then they paused. Beneath it they added, "No pressure. I just think I should have been clearer with you before." The message looked almost too simple compared with everything happening inside them. Yet simplicity felt right. Because underneath those few words lived the entire night, the unexpected question at the table, the third-party silence, the revelation about what you had once said, the old photograph, the repeated drafts, the realization that you deserved clarity, the understanding that your perspective had been missing from the story. Your soulmate did not need to place all of that on your screen immediately. They simply needed enough courage to make honest conversation possible. Their finger moved toward send. Then the phone lit up with another notification. For 1 second, your soulmate assumed it was unrelated. But when they saw the name on the screen, their expression changed completely. It was the person from last night, the one who had revealed what you once said. A new message had arrived. Just one sentence. And this time, it contained a detail they had intentionally left out of the conversation at the table. They wrote that there was another thing you had said about your soulmate that evening long ago, something they had not shared last night because they were not sure it was their place. But after thinking about everything, they believed your soulmate needed to know. Your soulmate opened the message. They read the sentence once. Then again. And the words on their own unfinished draft suddenly carried an entirely different weight, because what you had said back then was not about disappointment at all. It was about the one hope you had quietly held for the connection even while you were beginning to step away.